Hello, it's Thursday! So for months you will have been seeing snippets of a plucked chicken in the background of my videos. And then more recently she started a live stream where I got to chat to some of you, which was an absolute blast. Today I am finally going to tell you the story of designing and making the hundreds of pieces that I used to assemble Marigold. So about a year ago I designed 3 dragons. There was the hatchling, then came Chonk, and then a little bit after that came the 1-year-old. At the time I did show a sketch of another dragon. She was the mother. And that picture is the inspiration for today's video. Now, she hasn't really been a secret, so I know some of you are here with just one question, and that is, will there be a pattern? Some projects are made to be shared and replicated. For a number of reasons, this is not one of them. When I'm designing a pattern, I try to do it in such a way that I can explain it to someone else, so that they can take those instructions and make something that looks exactly like the original. Now, I'm by no means perfect at this, but I am working on it and I think I am getting better. So I started this project because I needed a stress relief from forcing myself to design in that very explainable way. Now, as I've been sharing my process with you guys, it's become increasingly obvious that a number of you are hoping I will release a pattern. At this point, I am not going to. I've been a bit nervous to release this video because I really don't like the thought of disappointing you guys. But a pattern was never the point of this project, and I am going to respect that. Now, I am already experiencing the benefits of having worked on Marigold, and I'm feeling really re-inspired, and I can't wait to sink my teeth into a whole lot of other new projects. But I have also kept the notes for Marigold, and at some point I will doubtless revisit her and create a version of her that, let's just say, has fewer pieces. So now let's get on with the show! So I started by sketching up the basic shape I wanted my dragon to be. I used the hatching dragon as a guide to work out how big I wanted to make the mama. Then I had to pick a colour to work up the base in. Now, as a rule of thumb for these ridiculously overcomplicated projects, I do try to pick a colour that I don't like for the base, so I do my best to cover every single inch of it. It also had to be a colour I had quite a lot of, as I knew this base was going to be quite big. And that's how I ended up with this particular shade of pink. It took me a minute to work out how to approach the shape that I wanted. So in the end, I decided to work up the main base as an oval, then planned to split it into back, neck, and tail segments. So kind of like I did for the Loch Ness Monster. So as I worked up my oval base piece, I did keep some notes, but it was as a way of helping me guide the shape as opposed to making it something to replicate. It's actually really weird to see myself crocheting from this angle. I keep feeling like my hook is in the wrong hand. So as you can see, I frequently pulled in the hatchling to help check my sizing. The base piece only needed to be roughly the right shape, as none of it will be visible, so I didn't have to spend any time worrying about stitch direction or keeping the edges neat. Once my oval base was big enough, I marked out roughly where I wanted the neck and tail to attach. Then I built in the chain loops as I worked my next row. Stopping to do a little math in the process. This is all just math sculpting after all. This works as the chain splits the base piece into 3 different sections that I can work up in the round. So one will form the neck, one will be the tail, and then the middle section will be closed off as the back. I finished working up the middle section to form the back first. You'll be able to see where I work over the chain loops to form the shape. I also ended up working backwards and forwards between the 2 chains for a couple of rows rather than around, as it gave me the flatter shape I was after. I think freehanding crochet really allows you to truly appreciate how forgiving of a medium yarn is. It's like it wants to take the shape you want it to take. There was also a really relaxing freedom in working up this piece, where I actually forgot to do a couple of my planned increases, but instead of having to frog it so that the notes would be correct, I just corrected it in the next row. At this point, it started to look more and more like a diaper of some sort, and I got a little bit worried. Sometimes though, you really do have to trust the process, even when there isn't a pattern. So I just kept working around and around until I had fully closed off the back in the shape that I wanted. I then reattached my yarn to the tail opening and started working up a long cone. It made sense to do the tail next, as I already knew I needed to leave the neck open. I'll talk more about that in a minute. After working up a couple of rows of the tail base, I stopped to work out what I was doing. A little diagram helped me work out where I needed to build in my short rows to get it to curl in the way that I wanted. The hatchling supervised because it was really important to me that he would fit into the curve of that tail. Then it was just a matter of adding length in between those short rows and slowly decreasing into that long cone. I stuck with no more than 2 or 3 decreases per row, so it would be a gradual decline. A weird lump did form at the base of the tail, but I knew I could fix it with stuffing and with the details, so I didn't worry about it. Now at this point, I stopped to stuff what I had, so I could make sure it was forming the shape that I expected and check to make sure it was to scale with the hatchling and just see what I was working with. You can kind of get a little bit of a peek into my thought process if you look at my notes in the background, as I have notes and diagrams scribbled literally all over the page. I worked up the base of the head next. Now, a lot of the shape is going to be created through the scale details, so I basically just needed a nugget to attach things to. I was careful not to make it too big so it wouldn't become disproportionate with the body once I'd attached all of those layers. Now, the head is a separate piece also for a utility reason. It's by far going to be the most detailed part of this lady, and it was going to be easier to work on separate from the bulk of the body, and I could easily just attach the two together afterwards. I also wasn't going to be able to tell where I wanted the eyes to be until after I had played with the scales and other details, so I needed to be able to clip them in at a later date. So again, it made sense to make the head as a separate piece and leave the neck open to attach it later. Now I also made sure to build the curve of the neck into the head as part of it, as it would be easier to hide the transition slightly further down. It also helps to avoid a floppy neck if you attach it this way. With the base of the head done, I reattached my yarn to the neck opening on the body piece. I was moving quickly through my second ball of the pink yarn and I patted myself on the back at this point for picking a colour I had so much of, because otherwise I definitely would have run out by now. At this point, I had already decided to change up the pose from the original so that the head and neck would be up instead of down. It just felt more right to me. The neck needed 3 different sets of short rows to get the curves right, but I got there in the end. So I basically stopped to stuff whenever things started feeling a bit floppy. I worked with the opening of the neck and the opening of the head until they were the same number of stitches around. This would mean I could sew through matched pairs of stitches, which would give me a smoother transition. I basically just worked with both pieces until I was happy with how the join would be. Now at this point she looks like a sassy earthworm, but I think you can already get a feel for the base shape and what she's going to become. I was really pleased with this new head position, and I think it allowed for way more meaningful posing that I felt better conveyed the feeling of the original sketch, even though the pose itself is different. I love the curve of the head to the neck and then around into the swish of the tail. I just think it flows really nicely. So with the head in the new position, more of the front claws were going to be visible, so I had to quickly sketch out new arms because you were going to see more of the shoulder and forearm. I have just now realised that I have completely forgotten to put hind legs on her. That's awkward. So I settled on this folded arm type position and worked up the base piece in the same pink. So just like a human, I've given her an upper arm, a lower arm, and a hand that will have claws on it. I planned to make the actual claws as a separate piece that could then slip over the base like a glove, so I didn't bother to finish off the hand end of the piece. I also needed to make sure it didn't take up too much room, as the hatchling fitting in the curve of the tail was really important to me. It turns out that Chomp could also fit, so all good. I then worked up the second arm. So this is the other reason I often take notes when I don't intend to make a pattern. Sometimes you need 2 pieces that look the same, even when freehanding. With the base piece basically complete, I turned my attention to what I wanted her final appearance to be. So I researched beautiful lizards and fancy birds to get a feel for how feathers and scales are supposed to sit. But finally I landed on flowers as my inspiration, specifically marigolds. I started by adding some eye sockets and then the nose piece. Now I made this nose piece in 3 different colours before settling on using my main sunshine yellow colour for it. I then also made some antenna horn thingies and some nostrils. I then made my first strand of scales and started arranging them around the eyes like the petals of a flower. At this point I realised the face was lacking in contrast, so I started making my scales in orange instead. I made each strand of scales with about 10 to 12 scales on it, and I found that this actually helps to keep all the tiny pieces together, as well as saving yarn, as I didn't lose so much in the making of the magic rings. Now the orange on its own was also a bit overpowering. I didn't want to lose all of my detail in an oversaturated colour, and I knew I would have to play around a bit to find something I was happy with, which brought me to these two-toned scales. So I'm not going to pretend that everything happened in some beautifully controlled order. I used some of my orange scales to stuff the ridges of the nose piece, and then I swapped to working up the claw gloves for the arms. Now, I made each claw and then finger separately before crocheting around them to form the palm. I also made an extra finger to be sewn on as a thumb or dew claw. The finished glove slipped on over the open end of the arm base beautifully. I was so happy with how they turned out, so I gave the same treatment to the second arm. I was also playing around with what scale patterns to do on them, so you can see I've studded one of the claws with orange scales. From there I worked up a pale yellow piece that was going to act as the bottom jaw. I wanted it to blend with the chest plates, but I also didn't want it to be too detailed so that it would draw focus. Once I'd worked it up to the right size, I stitched it on. It had to go on first as everything else was going to sit on top of it. So with the bottom jaw sewn on, assembly started in earnest. I started by sewing the scales into the ridges of the nose piece. It was way easier to do this before I tried to attach it. I then pinned it back in place and sewed around the edge to make sure it was firmly attached. Then I pinned all the other pieces of the face back on. You'll see me pin the nostrils, tweak the eye sockets a little, then cut my scales apart and start arranging them in their final locations. More than 70 pieces make up this headpiece alone, and each had to be sewn on individually. Now, sewing scales on can be a little tricky. It's easiest to position them correctly starting from the front and then working backwards, but then they need to be sewn on from the back moving forwards. So particularly with the scales, I stopped after each row to weave in the ends, remove the pins, and make sure everything was attached firmly. As you can see, I ended up layering yellow, orange, and jewel tone scales to get the marigold look I was after. And then I had to do the same thing to the other side. I also attached the nostrils at this point. The pieces were sewn on with matching yellow, then I used the contrasting orange to add the nose holes. At this point, I had prepped the base of both legs and some of the chest plates, and I began churning out scales in different colours and sizes. I wasn't aware at the time, but what you're seeing on screen right now is less than a third of what I would need to cover her completely. I had also tackled the wings. I didn't want to start attaching scales until I knew if I needed to add any additional structure to the body to help support them. I started by trying a more traditional reptile or bat type wing, but they were visually going to be very heavy and they just weren't working for me. They were also going to cover quite a lot of the scale detail I was adding, and I didn't like that. So I pivoted to a type of wing I've done quite a bit and decided to lean into the fairy dragon or dragonfly type aesthetic. These are just white cotton crocheted around a thin wire frame, and I think they look just perfect on our magical lady. At this point, with the head mostly assembled, I pinned all of the pieces I had in place to get a feel for her. So these are my two pin cushions, so you can see that literally every pin I owned was currently sticking something to Marigold, but she was really starting to come together. I then stripped everything away and positioned the chest plates. Just like the lower jaw, I wanted them to sit under the rest of the details. I had to remember to spiral them up the neck to make sure that they would make sense with the head posed looking to one side. They were super satisfying to sew on as they covered such a nice big area and gave the illusion of progress. I love the illusion of progress. Off camera, I had scaled up one of the legs just while I chilled out on the couch one evening. So each front leg is made up of approximately 96 pieces, including the base, toenails, fingers, and a whole lot of scales in both 4 single crochet and 6 single crochet sizes. I used a little editing magic to scale the second arm up in front of a little Netflix. Now the arms were ready to attach, so of course I stared at them for like 30 minutes to summon the courage to actually sew them on. I took a deep breath, pinned them, and started stitching. Once they were attached, it was finally time for the head, which was truly the point of no return. I pinned carefully, checking that she was posed correctly and adequately stuffed. I had taken the time to match the stitch counts of the two openings, so I just sewed matching pairs of stitches together. I then positioned the wings. Now these wings are really delicate, and I knew some major dragon yoga was going to be required to attach all of the scales, so they had to be attached last. You'll see me using my hook to poke down into the body where I want to insert the wire, as this just helps it slip in more easily. Working out where these wings go now means I can just mark the area out with some pins and attach the actual wings afterwards. Then I began the arduous task of attaching all the scales to the body. I ran out of scales 3 times. There are so many scales. So many scales. For the end of her tail, at the last moment I decided to make it a literal marigold instead of a fin or a spike. Now I couldn't find a marigold pattern that I liked, so I ended up just freehanding one. And that flower worked up all in one piece. By the time I was done, more than 500 scales had been individually sewn on, and that count is before I realised I had skipped the back legs. So this video is late to be uploaded because I literally realised this oversight as I was editing the footage together. So using basically the same structure as I had for the arms, I created 2 back feet. I then also removed a small patch of scales to attach the haunch. Making these brought the piece count up to more than 600 pieces. Last but certainly not least, I inserted the wings back into the position I had marked for each of them, sewing them in carefully, before positioning 2 spare scales I had left aside over the top. Come here, beautiful. So here is Marigold. Note that she does have back legs now. Now, she is still missing her underbelly, so she's by no means like finished, but she's as finished as she's getting for now. Now, the total piece tally came to 602 pieces. And I like to think that you can tell. I like to think that you can tell when you put that much energy and effort into something. What's funny to me is that she only cost about 25 bucks in materials. Okay, so if you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you'd hit that like button and maybe think about subscribing. I love that her little baby can just fit in here like this. You can have a little moment. Things got a little bit squashier once I put that back leg in though, I'm not gonna lie. I hope you all have an incredible week, and I will see you all in the first week of April with a new pattern. Okay, bye!